All right, welcome, Trinity teens, as we continue going through the book of John, and specifically as we continue through John chapter 6. So we will be covering today verses 22 through 29 in this video segment. So as the pattern has been, I'd ask you at this time, if you haven't already done so, to pause the video, talk to the Lord for a moment, and just ask him to use this time of looking at his word and considering his word, and ask him to use it in your heart at this point. And then once you're done praying, read through verses of chapter 6, verse 22 through verse 29. Maybe read it through once or twice, and write things down if you're taking notes. Write questions down. That's good. Do that. And then, so once you've done that, then press play and we will get started. So think about the big picture that we're in here of chapter 6, all right? As we looked at in the last couple of videos, Jesus had done this massive miracle of feeding the 5,000, as we call it. And then in verse 14, 15, the people have a wrong idea about Jesus. We talked about that in the last video segment. So Jesus leaves, and the people are wondering what happened to him. They see the disciples leave, and they're wondering where Jesus and his disciples went. And so then they follow him, as you've hopefully picked up on by reading through the passage here. So what I want you to think about here in chapter 6 is that much like chapter 5, in which Jesus healed the lame man, and the rest of chapter 5 is conversation and teaching surrounding that. That's really what happens in how John formulates chapter 6 here, is that there's the feeding of the 5,000, and then the crowd's reaction to that, and then Jesus' conversation and teaching that's all stemming from that right there, okay? So just think about that in the big picture in that regard. So if you've read through the passage, then you'll see in verse 22 through 24, what I want us to think about here is the people's misguided minds, all right? The people follow Jesus. I don't know if you picked up on this, but it's almost like in a desperate or fanatical way. Okay, now they've seen this great miracle that he's done among so many other miracles. And if you remember, in the beginning of chapter 6 and verse 2, it says they're following him because of the miracles that he was doing. All right? So I don't know if that stood out to you at all, that they follow him across the Sea of Galilee. And it says that they get a whole bunch of boats. And so people are just piling into boats, going across the Sea of Galilee to Capernaum to find Jesus. And there's almost this desperate fanaticism about it. And here's the thing, is that people can get wrapped up in something, maybe even something good, like Jesus, for the wrong reason. That's what these people do. They are wrapped up in who Jesus, well, not who Jesus is, they're wrapped up in what they think Jesus can do for them. And as we'll see, and hopefully as you're starting to realize, is for the wrong reasons. So I think as it will become evident, we're going to see that the people they're looking for happiness or maybe even satisfaction, but they're looking at Jesus in the wrong way for that satisfaction. So when they come to him, they finally find him, and the end of the chapter tells us that this all takes place in the synagogue. They asked in verse 40 or 25, and when they had found him on the other side of the sea, they said unto him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? Or when did you get here? And notice in verse 26, Jesus doesn't answer their question. He instead goes to the issue that's at hand. Why are they following him? Why are they following him? He doesn't answer the question. He goes right to the issue at hand. And so really think about this, is that Jesus is lovingly confronting them. This is Jesus' loving confrontation. Can you see that in verse 26 through 29? That Jesus is seeking to redirect their focus. All right. Look at verse 26. He says, I'm telling you the truth. Verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek me not because ye saw the miracles, but because ye did eat of the loaves and were filled. So he's calling out their flaw. That's why I said loving confrontation, is because he is lovingly confronting them by calling out their flaw. And he says, you're seeking me not because you saw the miracles, but because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. So right now, they're following him for the wrong reason, or reasons. Initially, they were following, in the beginning of chapter 6, they were following because of the miracles. But then we saw in verse 14 and 15, it had turned into what kind of, is Jesus the Messiah that I want him to be? And then now it's even maybe degraded even more into they're following him because he fed them, because he provided this huge meal. He provided so much food that there was leftovers. And so in Jesus, in calling out their flaw, Jesus simply puts it, you're working for the wrong thing. Look at verse 27. What's his explanation? He says, labor not for the meat or food which perisheth, but for that food which endures unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you. For him hath God the Father sealed. What's Jesus saying here in verse 27? Labor not, or don't work for food that perishes, but for food that endures unto everlasting life. What's Jesus trying to say there? I'd encourage you to pause here and consider and chew on this verse for a minute. What is Jesus saying that they should be doing? Do that. Put that down into your own words, what Jesus is saying here in verse 27. Here's how I put it. Jesus is telling them that eternal things in relationship with God should be the goal. That's what they should be working for. And we might think about that and say, well, of course, right? But the people aren't getting it, which is why Jesus is saying this. He's teaching in this way. Eternal things in relationship with God should be the goal. He says, don't work for the food that perishes. Jesus says, I gave you food. That only satisfies for a little bit. It's the next day and they're already hungry. Okay? Jesus is saying, don't work for the food that doesn't last, but work for the food which endures unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you. So think about this. If something matters to us, if something matters to us, we'll work for the things that matter to us. So our work should match our goals, right? And Jesus is saying here, Jesus himself is the true goal, and he's confirmed by God. That's where that end of verse 27, he says, for him hath God the Father sealed, meaning that Jesus has put his stamp of approval on Jesus by sending him to the world to provide salvation for mankind. So Jesus should be the goal. Belief in Jesus should be the goal. And then the action should flow out of that belief. We'll come back to this point here in a moment. So think about this. That's what these people are doing. They're working for the wrong thing. Think about this. Are they following Jesus? Yes, they're following Jesus. That's what these people are doing. They're working, laboring, following Jesus. They're trying to find Jesus, so they've been working in that way. But what's their goal? Their goal is the provision that Jesus can give for them, maybe even entertainment, or as we saw in verses 14 and 15, the type of Messiah that they want. So that's their goal, and so that is how they're laboring. And Jesus is saying, you're working for something that doesn't last. Even the way that you are viewing me is the wrong way. So when Jesus brings up this aspect of work, when he says labor not or don't work, the people actually, they latch on to that, because you look at what they ask in verse 28. Then said they unto him, what shall we do that we might work the works of God? What's the work of God that we should be doing? And this is a good legitimate question, I think. It's a good legitimate question. I want to please God. What do I have to do? What do I have to do? What's the work that I have to do? So here's again, I want you to pause the video and I want you to think about that. And even do this. Look ahead to verse 29 because Jesus gives them the answer. What's the work that we're supposed to do? Jesus gives them the answer. So I want you to do this. Pause the video and try and sum up in your own words what Jesus is saying in verse 29. Sum up Jesus' answer. I'd be interested to hear what you wrote down. Hopefully it's pretty simple because Jesus' answer is very simple here in verse 29. He gives them God's work. What is God's work? Let's read the verse. Jesus answered and said unto them, this is the work of God, that ye believe on him whom he hath sent. It's very simple, isn't it? What's God's work? Believe in Jesus. You want to please God? Believe in Jesus. I want you to notice a couple things here. What's the actual physical work that we're supposed to do? Or that what Jesus is telling the people to do? What's the labor, the action that they're supposed to do? It's very simple. There is no physical action. It's belief on Jesus. So it is not a work that we can do. There's not an action that we do. It is, the work is all God. The action is all God. Belief in Jesus is how we please God. It doesn't require any physical deeds on our part. You know, and what the Jewish people are going to jump to here, and probably where our minds want to go to as well, is, but wait a second, how do I stand righteous before God? Is it, I do good things, my good things outweigh my bad things, and God's okay with that? No. For the Jewish people, is it about keeping the law? No. Is it about keeping the 10 Commandments? No. That's the thing. They want something tangible, and people today, we want something tangible, something, here's the key. We want something that we can accomplish, in order to please God. And isn't that the whole point of Jesus? Is that he accomplishes the righteousness that we cannot. Therefore, the only thing that we can do is to believe in God's work, believe in Jesus as our only means of righteousness. So there's no physical action on our part that we can do. That's why John, as he writes in the book of 1 John, and actually I want you to turn there to the book of 1 John chapter 3. And I've got it bookmarked in my Bible so I can get there faster. So if you need to pause and turn there for a second. So 1 John chapter 3. When John is writing this letter to believers, he tells them the same thing. So 1 John chapter 3 and verse 23, he says, and this is his commandment. This is the commandment from God, that we should believe on the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another as he gave us commandment. And he that keepeth his commandments dwelleth in him, and he in him. So there again, in just a different area of the Bible, and it's still the same author who heard this directly from Jesus, he's telling the believers, we need to be reminded, how do we please God? By our belief in Jesus. Again, let's go back up to it for a moment here. That what you believe in, or your goals maybe, the actions should match up with that. When our belief in Jesus, or let me back up. The actions of the Christian life flow out of belief in Jesus, and therefore obedience to Jesus, and therefore love for Jesus. That's when the right actions come. That is when the Christian life, maybe as we want to say it, is looking right. So to do God's work, the Christian must believe. That's what Jesus says in verse 29. And then the correct actions will flow out of that belief. That's what he's saying in verse 27. So you look at verse 29 and then you look back at verse 27. To do God's work, the Christian must believe, and then the correct actions will flow out of that belief. The conversation is going to continue here, and we'll obviously pick up in the next video segment. But I want you to think about that, obviously just this passage, and how does this apply personally to your life? Are your actions flowing out of your belief in Jesus? So again, I'd ask you to, once you pause the video here, once you end it, to spend some time with the Lord and consider your belief in Jesus and how it needs to strengthen and grow. So thanks for watching. I hope it's an encouragement and a blessing to you.